Welcome back to our fantastic 8-parter, and right now with episode 6, Dune. 1984's Dune. Tony, your initial thoughts?
Oh man, this movie. You guys. Well, first of all, the intro song is actually pretty cool, and the introduction is pretty sweet, other than once it cuts to the princess sort of expositioning her way through the opening of the plot. It's a little forced and awkward feeling, and also she fades in and out visually, and I couldn't really discern the purpose behind that.
Several times, in fact.
Yeah, like, just, it keeps going, and there doesn't seem to be any logical reason for it. What about you?
I'm going to go ahead and give a spoiler alert for my score later on and say that I like almost nothing about this movie.
Same.
It was directed and written by David Lynch, and what's funny about this is that David Lynch actually used a pen name when the movie first came out. I forget what the pen name is now, but for someone to want to say, I don't want to put my real name on this film, probably says something right off the bat. As we said, the movie came out December 1984. It cost $40 million, only made back about $30 million. I'm a little bit surprised by its cost because it does look visually expensive. However, I'm not surprised at all by its return. I think that the word of mouth probably was terrible for this film in 1984.
Absolutely.
For people going back and thinking to themselves, man, what the heck am I looking at? You know, and speaking of that, let's go into the plot. What is it?
I don't have the slightest idea, my friend. I watched and paid very close attention to what was happening throughout this entire movie, and I could not tell you what happened, what it was about. It was an absolute mess. And from what I understand, they tried to pack about 2 or 3 of the Dune books into this movie, and I feel like that's probably a lot of the reason why it didn't end up making any sort of sense at all, is it was really trying to do way too much.
Part of that also is that it could be because it was going through several rewrites. The film had been trying to be made. They had tried to make the film since 1971, and it was stalled several times. It finally got off the ground between 1981 and 1983 by Lynch's treatment. So maybe it was kind of like a Super Mario Brothers treatment where it just got too many rewrites and too many things got jumbled up. I don't know. I can't give a logical explanation. Somebody's going to have to ask David Lynch, but this movie is an absolute mess. It is difficult to understand. I have a general idea. Planet Arrakis. Spice. Weird alien creatures. Everybody wants the spice. Beyond that, I'm a little bit lost.
Yeah, that's about as much as I could glean from it, too. And, like, the main character, Paul, was, like, some sort of chosen one thing. But, I mean, it was never really thoroughly explored what he was chosen for, or, like, what his ability really was, or anything. It's just he's got some sort of destiny.
Paul Atreides in this film was played by Kyle MacLachlan, who played Cliff in the Flintstones. I don't know if you remember the boss guy from the Flintstones.
Yeah, absolutely, he did. He also played the detective, I don't remember his name, but the detective from Twin Peaks.
Excellent.
Which is another David Lynch work. It's a TV series as opposed to a movie. But
very interesting. The cast is rounded out by Francesca Annis as Lady Jessica. She had a very interesting performance. I mean, the hard thing to say about this film is it's one of those times where you can't really fault the actors. You can't really fault them for what they're reading on the paper.
No, they were given atrocious dialogue. Like, it was some of the most unnatural dialogue I've ever heard in my life. None of it made any sense, and none of it sounded like any person who I've ever heard speak. Like, it's just not good.
Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck.
He did the best he could. God bless him. Patrick Stewart's one of the greatest actors of all time, and he tried. He really did. And I mean, I would say he probably had the best performance in the movie, but that's not saying a whole lot.
Man, I would love to have been able to sit in on some of the screenwriting sessions for this film. Do you know this film was actually the rough cut without special effects ran over 4 hours long?
My God.
And it's one of those films where you're thinking to yourself, whoever's writing this, are you thinking of are you mindfully going through and dissecting what does and doesn't make sense, or are you just kind of saying, oh, that sounds good, let's just throw it all in there?
It was just such a mess, just an absolute mess, and I don't think anyone had any sort of hand in editing. It was just sort of thrown together.
Universal's actually approached Lynch about releasing a director's cut version of the film, but he has declined and refuses to discuss Dune in interviews.
Even David Lynch hates this movie. Like, he's not proud of it at all.
It was, however, nominated for an Academy Award for Best Sound.
The soundtrack was okay, and the sound effects were pretty decent, but the soundtrack it was a little strange to me because they had the band Toto do the soundtrack, and I don't know if you guys remember Toto, but they did that Africa song, I Bless the Rains Down in Africa. That's their claim to fame, and I don't really understand the choice behind them doing the soundtrack. And I mean, they didn't do a bad job, but it was pretty unremarkable.
The music and the score, yeah, you're right. For me, it was just kind of repetitive. It was long. It was just kind of dragged out. It just wasn't anything special.
No, not at all.
Toto or not. The look of the film, cinematography, it has some interesting things to it. I mean, there are some. The sand worlds in particular are very visually interesting to look at.
Absolutely.
But they would be more interesting to look at if they made sense to me in context of what was going on.
Exactly. They were a visual spectacle. Honestly, the movie itself, the best thing about this movie was the set design, the costume design, some of the special effects. The special effects were wildly inconsistent in quality, but and designs for the creatures, like the sandworms and that weird guy that floated in the thing that
he's a diplomat.
Yeah, that guy.
Of some sort.
Yeah. And he there was one point in the movie later on where he was shooting stuff out of his body, and I don't really understand the purpose of it. It didn't have any context whatsoever. But the set design itself, each house had a different distinct aesthetic. The house Atreides was very regal and very royal looking, whereas the house Harkonnen looked very grimy and dirty, and that was definitely an interesting aesthetic to me. But and the direction itself though was pretty hit or miss.
This is one of those movies that if I were a studio executive, I would have just said, we shouldn't be putting this movie out in the theaters. I know it's got to make its money back. You lost $40 million, but sometimes you just got to lose $40 million. Otherwise, you end up with a director who doesn't want to talk about the film 30 years later.
Yeah, it's just, it shouldn't have seen the light of day.
Definitely not. Running through here on the plot, I score the plot the lowest. For me, like I said, the plot from the very... I actually, when I first started watching the movie, the dialogue at the very beginning, I rewound that about 2 or 3 times, trying to understand what she was talking about.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is kind of it's one of those architect from the Matrix Reloaded type speeches where I'm like, okay, this is interesting. It's going to be very philosophical, very interesting. And then by the 3rd time I listened to her, I was just thinking, my gosh,
what did she say? I knew all of those words, but they weren't strung together in any sort of way that made sense.
Right. So, running down here, how would you score Dune?
Oh god, the plot, as you said, is definitely the lowest point because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It doesn't tell a cohesive story. There are characters introduced and then mean nothing. They hired Sting to play a character in this movie, and he's in it for a grand total of 5 minutes. And I can't imagine that he was cheap to get in that movie. But yeah, there are a lot of characters and a lot of plot points introduced and then never thoroughly explained. The acting was pretty bad, but like you said, you can't really fault them because they had terrible dialogue to work with. The music was pretty mediocre. It was nothing awful, but it was just completely unmemorable. And the direction was hit or miss, but I think overall it was probably the best aspect of the movie.
What was your overall score on it?
3 out of 10.
3 out of 10. I actually ended up with a 5.25 out of 10, and I don't know how. That's a little bit higher than I was expecting. We kind of what we do here is we base our scores off of plot, music score, cinematography, acting performance, etc., and then we average those out to get our individual scores. And I don't know how I scored this high. Maybe I need to relook at this, but somehow I gave Dune a 5.25, and that's being very generous.
That's lofty praise for this movie.
Yeah. So Our final Relic score on Dune is going to be a 4.2. Now, this movie is a cult classic to some. I do know of a couple of people who seem to... My oldest brother, I remember when I was younger, watched this movie all the time. I don't know if he just thought it looked cool or what, but I wonder now what he would think if he watched it now. So, to any viewers out there that enjoy Dune, or to any viewers out there that have possibly read the books that still want to give it a try, maybe you guys will understand it better than we did. We're not discouraging you from watching it, but
I wouldn't recommend it. But but if you have that curiosity, then by all means go out and watch it. But it's
for episode 6 on Dune. Hopefully episode 7, which again is part of our 8-parter here, is going to be a little bit more exciting, a little bit more thrilling, and that's going to be Vertical Limit, starring Chris O'Donnell, one of the great 90s guys. So join us for episode 7 over on Vertical Limit and see what we have to say about that.
Thank you for joining us.